harsh fluorescent lights of the children's shelter cast long shadows across the cafeteria floor as 8-year-old Emma stared down at her plate with tears streaming down her hollow cheeks. The watery soup, consisting of little more than broth, with a few sad vegetables floating aimlessly, had grown cold during the 15 minutes she'd been sitting there, trying to summon the courage to take another spoonful. Her small hands trembled as she gripped the plastic spoon, her knuckles white from the effort of holding back the sob that threatened to escape her throat. "I can't eat this anymore," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible above the chatter of the other children around her. The words carried the weight of months of disappointment, of nights when she'd gone to bed with her stomach gnawing at itself, of mornings when she'd wake up dizzy from hunger, only to face another day of the same tasteless, insufficient meals. Emma had been at Sunshine Children's Home for 8 months now, ever since the night the social workers had found her huddled in a cardboard box behind the grocery store, clutching a photograph of her mother who had disappeared without a trace. The shelter was overcrowded and underfunded, housing 43 children in a facility designed for 20. The staff did their best with what little they had, but the reality was that there simply wasn't enough food to go around, and what food they could afford was of the poorest quality. The other children had learned to accept their circumstances, wolfing down whatever was placed before them with the resigned efficiency of those who understood that complaining wouldn't change anything. But Emma couldn't adapt. Every meal felt like a reminder of the warm kitchen she'd once known, where her mother would hum softly while preparing their simple but loving dinners. She remembered the smell of fresh bread, the sound of vegetables sizzling in the pan, the way her mother would always save the best pieces for her, even when money was tight. Mrs. Rodriguez, the head caretaker, noticed Emma's untouched plate and approached with the weary expression of someone who had seen too many hungry children and had too few resources to help them all. Her graying hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and her uniform bore the stains of a dozen different spills from the day's activities. Despite her stern appearance, her eyes held genuine concern as she knelt beside Emma's chair. "Mija, you need to eat something," she said gently in her accented English, placing a weathered hand on Emma's shoulder. "I know it's not what you're used to, but it's all we have right now. The funding has been cut again, and we're doing our best to stretch every dollar." Emma looked up at Mrs. Rodriguez, her green eyes swimming with unshed tears. "It tastes like sadness," she said, with the brutal honesty that only children possess. "Everything here tastes like sadness, and I can't swallow sadness anymore. It makes my throat close up and my heart hurt." The caretaker's own eyes misted over at the child's, words recognizing the poetry in her pain. Emma had always been different from the other children, more sensitive, more articulate, more aware of the world's cruelties despite her tender age. While the other kids played with broken toys and found joy in simple games, Emma would often sit by the window, staring out at the world beyond with an expression far too mature for her years. "I understand, sweetheart," Mrs. Rodriguez whispered, fighting back her own tears, "but you're getting so thin. Dr. Martinez is worried about you, and so am I. Please, just try to eat a little bit." "For me?" Emma shook her head slowly, pushing the bowl away with such finality that some of the soup sloshed onto the scratched table surface. "I can't pretend anymore that this is okay. I can't pretend that this is how children are supposed to live. I used to dream about food, real food, good food, but now I don't even remember what it tastes like." The cafeteria had grown quieter around them, other children sensing the gravity of the moment, even if they couldn't fully understand it. Tommy, a 6-year-old with a gap-toothed grin, had stopped mid-bite to watch Emma with curious eyes. Maria, who shared Emma's dormitory room, clutched her own spoon tighter, as if Emma's refusal might somehow make her own meager meal disappear. Mrs. Rodriguez was about to respond when the front door of the shelter creaked open, its hinges protesting, with a sound that echoed through the building like a gunshot. Everyone turned to see who might be visiting at this unusual hour. It was well past the time when social workers or potential adoptive families typically came by. The footsteps that followed were measured and confident, accompanied by the soft tapping of what sounded like an expensive walking cane against the worn linoleum floor. Emma lifted her head, wiping her tears with the back of her hand as curiosity momentarily overtook her despair. Through the doorway, she could see the silhouette of a tall figure, backlit by the setting sun that streamed through the shelter's front windows. The figure moved with purpose, and there was something about the way he carried himself that suggested this was no ordinary visitor. The footsteps grew closer, and Emma found herself holding her breath, as if sensing that whatever was about to happen would change everything. The other children had fallen completely silent now, their attention focused on the approaching stranger. Even Mrs. Rodriguez straightened up, smoothing her uniform and trying to compose herself for whoever this unexpected visitor might be. And then, as if summoned by Emma's whispered words of desperation, a man stepped into the cafeteria doorway, a man whose presence seemed to fill the entire room with possibility. The man who entered the cafeteria was unlike anyone who had ever set foot in Sunshine Children's home. He stood at least 6 feet tall, with silver hair that caught the fluorescent lights and reflected them back like polished steel. His charcoal gray suit was immaculately tailored, fitting his frame with the precision that only comes from the world's finest clothiers, and his Italian leather shoes gleamed despite having walked through the shelter's less than pristine hallways. But it wasn't his expensive attire that commanded attention. It was the way he carried himself, with a quiet confidence that spoke of a man who had built empires and changed lives with the stroke of a pen. His eyes, a piercing blue that seemed to see everything at once, swept across the room with the methodical precision of someone accustomed to assessing situations quickly and thoroughly. They lingered for a moment on each child's face, cataloging their expressions, their posture, their unspoken stories. When his gaze finally settled on Emma, still sitting with her untouched bowl of soup, something shifted in his expression. A flicker of recognition, perhaps, or maybe just the awakening of a memory he thought he had buried long ago. "Good evening," he said, his voice carrying the cultured accent of someone who had been educated in the finest schools but had never lost touch with his humanity. The words seemed to resonate in the sudden silence, each syllable clear and purposeful. "I apologize for arriving unannounced. My name is Alexander Hartford, and I believe I may have heard something that requires my immediate attention." Mrs. Rodriguez stepped forward, her professional demeanor warring with her obvious bewilderment. In her 15 years of working at the shelter, she had never encountered anyone quite like this mysterious visitor. "Mr. Hartford, I'm Maria Rodriguez, the head caretaker here. I'm afraid visiting hours ended some time ago, and we weren't expecting anyone this evening. If you're interested in making a donation or perhaps discussing adoption procedures, perhaps we could schedule an appointment for tomorrow morning." Alexander Hartford raised his hand gently, not in dismissal but in the manner of someone who understood the protocols but needed to bypass them for reasons that would soon become clear. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I assure you that my intentions are entirely honorable, and I will be more than happy to go through proper channels for anything that requires official documentation. However, I was walking past your facility just now, something I do every evening during my constitutional, when I heard something through that open window that I simply cannot ignore." He pointed toward a window that had been propped open to combat the stifling heat of the overcrowded cafeteria. The evening breeze that drifted through carried with it the sounds of the city beyond, traffic, distant voices, the general hum of urban life. But Alexander Hartford had somehow managed to isolate one small voice among all that noise, one whispered confession of despair that had reached him through the gathering dusk. "I heard a young lady say that she couldn't eat something anymore," and the tone of her voice suggested that this was not merely a matter of preference but rather a statement of profound distress. His eyes found Emma again, and this time she didn't look away. Instead, she found herself drawn into those blue depths, seeing something there that she couldn't quite name. Understanding, perhaps, or recognition of a kindred spirit who had once known suffering of his own. Emma's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. She had never been the focus of such intense, compassionate attention from a stranger, and she wasn't sure how to respond. The other children were staring openly now, their own meals forgotten, as they witnessed this unprecedented intrusion into their ordered, predictable world. Alexander Hartford moved closer, his expensive cane tapping softly against the floor with each measured step. Up close, Emma could see that the cane was beautifully crafted, with an ivory handle carved in the shape of a lion's head, its eyes inlaid with what might have been genuine sapphires. But more importantly, she could see the lines around his eyes. Lines that spoke of someone who had smiled often and worried deeply, someone who had known both triumph and tragedy in equal measure. "Young lady," he said, addressing Emma directly while maintaining a respectful distance, "would I be correct in assuming that you are the one who made that particular observation about your meal?" Emma nodded slowly, her voice catching in her throat as she tried to form words. When she finally spoke, it was barely above a whisper. "I said I couldn't eat this anymore, but I didn't mean for anyone to hear me. I was just talking to myself." "Alexander." Hartford's expression softened further, and he lowered himself onto one knee beside her chair, bringing himself down to her eye level, despite the obvious cost to his expensive suit. "Sometimes the most important things we say are the ones we think nobody is listening to. May I ask why you feel you cannot eat your meal?" The question was asked with such genuine interest, such complete absence of judgment, that Emma found herself answering before she could think to hold back. "Because it doesn't taste like food is supposed to taste. It tastes like giving up. It tastes like nobody cares. And I can't swallow that anymore because if I do, I think I might forget that things can be different." A profound silence fell over the cafeteria. Even Mrs. Rodriguez, who had heard countless heartbreaking stories during her years at the shelter, felt tears prick at her eyes. The other children seemed to understand on some instinctive level that Emma had articulated something they had all felt but had never been able to express. Alexander Hartford was quiet for a long moment, studying Emma's face with the intensity of someone solving a complex puzzle. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested each word had been carefully considered. "That is perhaps the most eloquent and accurate description of institutional despair that I have ever heard, and I have heard many. You are absolutely correct. Food should never taste like giving up. Food should taste like hope, like love, like the possibility of better days ahead." He stood slowly, his joints protesting the movement with small sounds that reminded everyone present that despite his commanding presence, he was not a young man. But his voice grew stronger as he continued, filling the room with the authority that seemed to transform the very air around them. "My dear Mrs. Rodriguez, I wonder if you might indulge an old man's curiosity and tell me about the current state of your food budget and meal planning. I suspect that what I'm seeing here is not a failure of caring, but rather a failure of resources." Mrs. Rodriguez looked around nervously, clearly uncomfortable discussing the shelter's financial struggles with a stranger, no matter how well-dressed or seemingly well-intentioned he might be. "Mr. Hartford, I appreciate your concern, but our internal finances are really not something I can discuss with someone who isn't affiliated with our organization or the city's social services department." "Of course, and I respect your discretion entirely. However, perhaps I can share some information about myself that might help you understand why I'm asking." Alexander Hartford reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a simple leather wallet. From it, he extracted a business card that he handed to Mrs. Rodriguez with a small smile. She took the card and her eyes widened as she read it. Her hand began to tremble slightly, and she had to read it twice before she could trust what she was seeing. "Hartford Industries. Hartford Foundation. You're Alexander Hartford. The Alexander Hartford." "I am indeed, though I try not to let that go to my head," he replied with a self-deprecating chuckle. "I suspect that even the children here might have heard my name, though probably not in the most flattering contexts. The newspapers do so, enjoy their stories about wealthy businessmen, particularly when those stories involve corporate mergers and market fluctuations that most people find rather tedious." Emma had indeed heard the name, though she couldn't quite place where. It seemed to her that it was the sort of name that adults spoke in hushed tones, usually followed by very large numbers that didn't make much sense to her 8-year-old mind. But what did make sense was the way Mrs. Rodriguez was looking at him now, with a mixture of awe, hope, and barely controlled excitement. "Mr. Hartford," Mrs. Rodriguez said carefully, "if you don't mind my asking, what exactly are you doing here? I mean, what brought you to our neighborhood, to our shelter at this particular time?" Alexander Hartford's expression grew thoughtful, and for a moment, He seemed to be looking not at the people in front of him, but at something far in the past. That, Mrs. Rodriguez, is a story that begins many years ago with another little girl, who also found it difficult to swallow food that tasted like despair. A little girl who, like your young lady here, had the courage to say that the situation she found herself in was simply not acceptable. He turned back to Emma, whose eyes had grown wide with curiosity. That little girl was my sister, and her name was Catherine. She would have been about your age when she taught me one of the most important lessons of my life, that sometimes the smallest voices speak the greatest truths, and that when someone says they cannot accept the unacceptable any longer, the rest of us have a moral obligation to listen. Alexander Hartford moved to the center of the cafeteria, his presence commanding the attention of every person in the room. Even the youngest children seemed to sense that something momentous was unfolding before their eyes. The fluorescent lights above cast harsh shadows across his weathered features, but his eyes remained warm and focused as he began to share a story that would forever change the lives of everyone present. Catherine and I grew up in circumstances not entirely unlike what I see here tonight, he began, his voice carrying the weight of decades-old memories. Our father disappeared when I was 12 and she was 8, the same age as our brave young lady here. Our mother worked 3 jobs just to keep a roof over our heads, but even then, there were nights when we went to bed hungry, mornings when we had to choose between heating the apartment and buying groceries. Emma found herself leaning forward, drawn into the story despite her earlier despair. Something about the way Alexander Hartford spoke made her feel as though he truly understood the hollow ache that lived permanently in her chest, the way everything seemed to taste of disappointment and broken promises. We lived in a tenement building on the Lower East Side of the city, in a one-room apartment that we shared with another family. The walls were thin, the heat rarely worked, and the smell of desperation seemed to seep through the very foundations of the building. But Catherine, his voice softened with affection and pain, Catherine refused to accept that this was simply how life had to be. He paused, reaching into his jacket pocket to withdraw a small, faded photograph that he handled with the reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. The image showed 2 children, a tall, serious-looking boy with dark hair and piercing eyes, and a smaller girl with blonde curls and a defiant smile that seemed to challenge the world itself. She had this way of looking at things that was entirely her own. Where I saw obstacles, she saw opportunities. Where I saw closed doors, she saw windows waiting to be opened. And when the charity workers would come around with their watery soup and stale bread, she would look at them with those big blue eyes of hers and say, "This isn't how people are supposed to eat. This isn't how children are supposed to live, Mrs." Rodriguez had pulled up a chair and was listening intently, her earlier administrative concerns forgotten in the face of this unexpected revelation. The other staff members had begun to filter into the cafeteria, drawn by the unusual scene of a wealthy stranger sharing intimate details of his childhood with a room full of disadvantaged children. The adults would pat her on the head and tell her that she should be grateful for what she had, that there were children in other parts of the world who had even less. But Catherine wasn't having any of that. She would stand up, all 4 feet of her, and she would say, "Just because someone else is suffering more doesn't mean we have to accept suffering at all. Just because this is how things are doesn't mean this is how things have to stay." Alexander Hartford's eyes found Emma again, and she felt a strange sensation, as if invisible threads were connecting her heart to his across the decades that separated his childhood from hers. She started small, the way all great changes begin. She convinced the other children in our building to pool their pennies, the few they could find in couch cushions or dropped on the street, and she would march down to the corner market and negotiate with Mr. Kowalski, the owner. "What did she buy?" Emma asked, her voice stronger now, caught up in the story despite herself. "Vegetables," Alexander Hartford replied with a smile that transformed his entire face. Fresh vegetables that she would somehow turn into meals that actually tasted like someone cared about whether we lived or died. She had no formal training, no cookbooks, no fancy equipment. Just an 8-year-old girl's absolute conviction that food should nourish both the body and the soul. He walked over to Emma's abandoned bowl of soup and looked down at it with an expression of profound sadness. She would have taken one look at this and said exactly what you said, that it tastes like giving up. And then she would have rolled up her sleeves and done something about it. What happened to her? Tommy asked from across the room, his gap-toothed lisp making the words sound even more innocent and heartbreaking. Alexander Hartford was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a grief that had been worn smooth by years but never fully healed. Catherine got sick the winter she turned 9. In those days, poor children didn't have access to the kind of medical care that might have saved her. She spent her last weeks in a charity hospital that was every bit as grim and hopeless as this cafeteria, eating food that tasted like despair and surrounded by adults who had given up on the idea that things could be better. The silence that followed was profound and heavy. Emma felt tears starting to form in her eyes again, but these were different from the tears of frustration and hunger she had shed earlier. These were tears of recognition, of understanding that her story was part of something much larger and more significant than she had ever imagined. But before she died, Alexander Hartford continued, his voice growing stronger again. She made me promise something. She made me swear that if I ever had the power to change things, really change things, not just throw money at problems, but actually transform how the world treats its most vulnerable children, that I would do it. She made me promise that no child would ever have to say what she said, what you said tonight, that they couldn't eat anymore because the food tasted like nobody cared. He reached into his other pocket and withdrew his cell phone, a sleek device that probably cost more than the shelter's entire monthly budget. But instead of making a call, he set it down on the table next to Emma's bowl and looked around the room with the expression of a general surveying a battlefield. Mrs. Rodriguez, I need you to understand something very clearly. I am not here tonight as a wealthy businessman looking for a tax write-off or a photo opportunity. I am not here as a philanthropist trying to salve his conscience with a charitable donation. I am here as a brother honoring a promise made to a dying sister 60 years ago. Mrs. Rodriguez nodded slowly, though Emma could see that she was struggling to process the magnitude of what was being revealed. Mr. Hartford, I don't know what to say. Your story is incredibly moving, but I'm not sure I understand what you're proposing to do. I'm proposing to fulfill Catherine's vision, he replied simply. I'm proposing to ensure that no child in this facility ever again has to eat food that tastes like despair. But more than that, I'm proposing to create something that Catherine never got to see. A place where children are not just fed, but nourished. Not just housed, but loved. Not just managed, but inspired to believe that they can change the world themselves. Emma felt something stirring in her chest, something she hadn't felt in months. Hope. Real hope. Not the fragile, desperate kind. That could be crushed by the next disappointment, but something solid and enduring. What do you mean? She whispered. Alexander Hartford knelt down beside her chair again, but this time he took her small hand in his much larger one. His skin was warm and soft despite his obvious age, and Emma could feel the faint tremor that suggested a lifetime of hard work and difficult decisions. I mean, my dear young lady, that you are about to discover what food tastes like when it's prepared by people who believe that every meal is an opportunity to show love, every bite a chance to communicate hope. I mean, that you are about to live in a place where your voice, the voice that was brave enough to say that the unacceptable is truly unacceptable, will be heard and valued and acted upon. He stood up and walked to the window that had carried Emma's whispered words out into the evening air, the same window through which he had heard the cry that had brought him to this moment. The sun had almost completely set now, and the city lights were beginning to twinkle in the distance like scattered diamonds against black velvet. Tomorrow morning, he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of lives, a team of architects, nutritionists, child psychologists, and educational specialists will arrive here to begin the most comprehensive transformation this facility has ever seen. But tonight, right now, we're going to address the immediate problem. He picked up his phone and dialed a number with the practiced ease of someone who had important people on speed dial. The conversation that followed was brief but intense, conducted in the clipped, efficient tone of a man accustomed to turning impossible dreams into concrete reality. Yes, it's Alexander Hartford. I need you to contact Giuseppe at Bellacorte. Immediately. I don't care what time it is in Italy. Wake him up if necessary. Tell him I need a full catering team here within the hour, and I want them to prepare a feast fit for 43 of the most important people in my world. Fresh bread, real soup, vegetables that still remember what sunlight tastes like, desserts that will make these children believe in magic again. Emma's eyes grew wider with each word, and she found herself gripping the edge of the table so tightly that her knuckles were white. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen to children like her in places like this. But Alexander Hartford wasn't finished. And contact Maria Gonzalez at the foundation. Tell her to activate the Hartford Emergency Response Fund immediately. Full budget authorization, no spending limits, complete discretionary authority. We have a promise to keep. As Alexander Hartford ended his call, the cafeteria had transformed from a place of resigned despair into something that hummed with anticipation and disbelief. The children who had been mechanically consuming their tasteless meals now sat transfixed, their eyes darting between the mysterious millionaire and Emma, as if trying to understand how their quiet, sensitive friend had somehow summoned this miracle into their lives. Emma herself felt as though she was living in a dream that was too vivid to be false but too wonderful to be real. Her hand still tingled from where Alexander Hartford had touched it, and she kept looking down at her fingers, as if expecting to see some visible sign of the magic that seemed to be flowing through the room. "Mr. Hartford," Mrs. Rodriguez said, carefully, her voice trembling with barely contained emotion. "I need to be honest with you. In my 15 years here, I've seen well-meaning people make grand promises that never materialized. These children have been disappointed so many times that I'm not sure their hearts can take another letdown. Are you absolutely certain you can deliver on what you're proposing?" Alexander Hartford turned from the window, and the expression on his face was one of such quiet determination that it seemed to banish doubt from the very air. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I have spent the last 60 years building a business empire for the sole purpose of being able to answer yes to that question when the right moment arrived. Tonight, because of one brave little girl's refusal to accept the unacceptable, that moment has finally come." He walked back to Emma's table and sat down across from her, folding his hands carefully in front of him. "Emma, may I call you Emma? I want you to understand something very important. What happens next is not charity, it's not pity, it's not even kindness, though I hope it will feel kind to you. What happens next is justice. It's the universe finally keeping a promise that was made to a dying child 60 years ago." Emma nodded slowly, not trusting herself to speak. The other children had begun to gather around their table, drawn by some instinct that told them this conversation would affect all their lives. "In about 45 minutes, Alexander Hartford continued, glancing at his expensive watch, "this room is going to fill with the most wonderful smells you can imagine. Giuseppe Bellacorte is the finest chef in the city. His restaurant has a waiting list 6 months long, and people fly in from other countries just to taste his food. But tonight he's going to cook for you, all of you." Tommy raised his small hand tentatively. "Will there be enough for everyone? Sometimes the good food runs out before the little kids get any." Alexander Hartford's smile was radiant. "Tommy, there will be enough for everyone to have seconds, thirds, and probably fourths if you want them. There will be fresh bread that's still warm from the oven, soup that tastes like your grandmother's, hugs, vegetables that remember what it's like to grow in real soil under real sunshine. And dessert?" He paused dramatically. "Giuseppe makes a chocolate cake that is rumored to make grown men weep with joy." A collective gasp went up from the children, and Emma saw several of them exchange glances of wonder and disbelief. But she also noticed something else. The gradual transformation in their postures, the way they were sitting up straighter, the light that was beginning to return to their eyes. "But that's just tonight," Alexander Hartford continued. "Tomorrow, the real work begins. I'm going to tell you what I'm planning to do because Catherine taught me that children deserve to know the truth about their own lives, even when that truth involves big, complicated, grown-up decisions." He stood up and began to pace slowly around the room, his hands clasped behind his back in the manner of a professor delivering a crucial lecture. "First, we're going to completely renovate this building from top to bottom. New dormitories that actually give you privacy and space to call your own. A real kitchen where real chefs will prepare real meals 3 times a day. A library filled with books that will take you anywhere in the world your imagination wants to go. Mrs. Rodriguez was frantically taking notes on a napkin, trying to keep up with the scope of what was being proposed. Mr. Hartford, the licensing requirements alone for that kind of renovation would take months to approve. The city bureaucracy moves very slowly, and there are so many regulations. Mrs. Rodriguez, I employ an entire law firm whose job is to navigate city bureaucracy. I also happen to sit on the board of the Urban Development Authority, and I may have had dinner with the mayor last week. When you have the resources I have, bureaucracy becomes less of an obstacle and more of a puzzle to be solved efficiently. Emma found herself smiling for the first time in months. There was something infectious about Alexander Hartford's confidence, something that made impossible things seem not just possible, but inevitable. But renovations are just the beginning, he continued. I'm also going to establish the Catherine Hartford Academy for Exceptional Children right here in this building. You'll have the finest teachers money can hire, small class sizes that ensure every child gets individual attention, and a curriculum designed not just to educate you, but to help you discover what makes you extraordinary. What if we're not extraordinary? Asked Maria, a shy 10-year-old who rarely spoke above a whisper. Alexander Hartford stopped pacing and looked at her with such intensity that she seemed to shrink back slightly. But his voice, when he answered, was gentle and warm. Maria, every child who has ever lived in a place like this and survived with their humanity intact is extraordinary by definition. The fact that you can still ask questions, still wonder about your place in the world, still hope for something better, that makes you more remarkable than most adults I know. He returned to Emma's table and sat down again, his attention focused entirely on her. And you, Emma, you're going to have a special role in all of this. Because you were brave enough to say what needed to be said, because your voice carried exactly the right words at exactly the right moment, you're going to help me make sure that what we build here truly serves the children who need it most. Emma's eyes widened. What do you mean? I mean that you're going to be my consultant on this project. Every decision we make about food, about living spaces, about education, about how we treat the children who come here, you're going to have input. Because Catherine taught me that the people closest to a problem usually have the clearest understanding of what the solution needs to look like. As if on cue, the sound of vehicles pulling up outside began to filter through the windows. Car. Doors slammed, and voices could be heard giving directions in rapid-fire Italian mixed with English. The smell that followed, the rich, complex aroma of real food prepared with love and skill, began to seep into the cafeteria like a warm embrace. Emma felt tears starting to flow down her cheeks again, but these were different from any tears she had shed before. These were tears of overwhelming gratitude, of hope so intense it almost hurt, of the sudden understanding that her life had just taken a turn toward something she had never dared to dream. Why? She whispered, looking up at Alexander Hartford through her tears. Why us? Why me? You could help anyone, do anything with your money. Why did you choose to help us? Alexander Hartford reached out and gently wiped away one of her tears. With his thumb, the gesture so paternal and kind that it nearly broke her heart all over again. Because, my dear Emma, Catherine is watching from wherever brave little girls go when they leave this world too soon. And tonight, when she heard your voice saying the same words she once said, she whispered in my ear that it was time to finally keep my promise. The doors to the cafeteria burst open, and a parade of chefs in pristine white uniforms began wheeling in carts laden with covered dishes that filled the air with the most incredible smells any of the children had ever experienced. Giuseppe Bellacorte, himself, a round, jovial man with flour still dusting his hands, beamed at the assembled children as if he had just discovered a room full of treasures. Bambini, he called out in his booming voice, tonight we feast. Tonight you taste what love tastes like. Emma looked around at her fellow residents of Sunshine Children's Home. Children who had arrived that evening resigned to another meal of watery soup and stale bread. Children who were now watching with wonder as tables were set with real plates and real silverware. Children whose faces were transforming from expressions of dull acceptance to something approaching joy. And in that moment, as the first plates of food were set before them, food that smelled like hope and tasted like the future, Emma understood that sometimes the most important thing a person can do is refuse to swallow despair. Sometimes, the bravest thing you can say is, "I can't accept this anymore." Because sometimes, just sometimes, the right person is walking by at exactly the right moment, carrying a 60-year-old promise and waiting for the sound of a child's voice to tell him that the time has finally come to change the world. As Emma took her first bite of Giuseppe's soup that tasted like sunshine and possibility and everything good that food could be, she looked up at Alexander Hartford and smiled through her tears of joy. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for listening." Alexander Hartford smiled back, and for a moment, Emma could swear she saw the ghost of a little girl with blonde curls and defiant blue eyes standing beside him, finally at peace. "No, Emma," he said softly. "Thank you for speaking."